I would like in this video to discuss the concept of UTXOs as tokens in Bitcoin. I think that there are some people in Bitcoin who think of tokens in certain ways and other people who think of tokens in different ways, and there are valid approaches on both sides of the argument. And it's not even just a two-side argument, it's multiple people have different visions for how tokens should work in Bitcoin. And I think it's worth illustrating some of these different methodologies and shedding light on some of the different possibilities so that everyone involved can gain a better understanding of the issue. I'm going to move to a different format here that I haven't done in the past, which is to try to set up a whiteboard where I can draw things and try to explain. So I'm not sure how this is going to work. Let me know if you'd like to see more or less of this. But if we think of tokens in Bitcoin, generally there's a token is something that represents something else, right? So we should understand that. At the beginning, when we think of tokenization in Bitcoin, we should think of, this digital token, this representation is pointing back to some underlying source of value. So the value that I get from my house, in that I could, for example, own it, reside in it, or my car, in that I could drive it from place to place, that's the real value that is being talked about here. And then the ownership is pointing to the person who has the right to benefit from certain property or certain arrangements. They could be contracts. They could be things that are useful. So that's really where the fundamentals start, and from there we find that it's useful to represent that value in a certain digital way, right? So we need a way to sort of have a link and a representation of the value. So I'll draw, right, like a two-sided arrow here, and I'll draw like a house. So this is a house. Yep. And, there's the door and whatever else. Okay, so there's my house, and there needs to be a way to represent using a piece of paper, right? So just a document, the title with the signature on the bottom. There needs to be a way to basically have a record of who owns what and represent that ownership in a useful way. And so this doesn't have anything to do with Bitcoin yet. You can have tokens without Bitcoin, and this is just one kind of token. If I clear this, can I? Yeah, I think I can just clear it like that. There can be other kinds of value that is represented by an agreement as well. So not just property ownership, but things like if I go to an amusement park and I want to ride on the carousel or something, and I'm not going to try to draw that for those interested. There's other ways of getting value out of something, and you represent and commodify almost. In that case, you say, these tokens, which are literal physical objects that represent the benefit that somebody might get out of, the fun they get from playing a game or something at a carnival. That's what tokens are. They represent something of value. And so when we think of tokens in Bitcoin, in fact, one time I spoke with a developer who's prominent for doing tokenization, and I think this particular developer called Stas understands tokens fairly well. I sent him a message and I was like, hey, I want to tokenize. I want to, use your token protocol or something. And his question was like, what do you want to tokenize, right? So that's a very important point is different people want to tokenize different things. And, using Bitcoin to do that, using BSV to do that, it's possible to tokenize things in different ways and still get the same system out of it at the end, right? So I may not want to, the technology, right? I may have one way of doing a token for representing a pass to get into a movie, right? Like a movie ticket. And someone might be able to use my software, my technology, my way of doing it, and benefit out of it. And then someone else, they don't really care. They get this token when they buy it, or when they otherwise acquire it. They're then able to use it, and they're able to get to the value that they were promised by, for example, watching the movie. And so the person that uses the token in that context, the token is functional, and thus it doesn't necessarily matter so much the technology specifically being used. That's why I say there's multiple approaches, because when I consider tokenization on Bitcoin, there are different ways of doing it, actually, and different people are going to do things differently. So one of the biggest approaches that I like to use, and now we'll get into specifics, right? I'll say, now we have the fundamentals covered, and there's multiple ways of doing things. Now I wanted to get into one of the ways that I advocate for doing things on Bitcoin, which is not the only way. But for the reasons I'll lay out here, I think that using what's called a UTXO in Bitcoin as a token is probably the best way, in my opinion, compared to doing things like ordinals or things like op return-based, just using the blockchain as a journaling system. So let's explore the different implications. Now we get into some fundamentals of Bitcoin. In Bitcoin, there are transactions, and transactions have inputs and outputs. When you have an input to a transaction, it is a way for the transaction to consume some previous state or value, and then use it as a way to achieve a new state or value, which is represented by an output. So inputs unlock previous outputs, and outputs stipulate locks that are going to facilitate future inputs in other transactions. So every transaction, which we can represent here, has inputs which come in from somewhere else, and it has outputs which go out, and they're just kind of there. They don't really go anywhere yet, but future transactions could, grab onto one of these and use it as an input in the future. So we have inputs and outputs in transactions, and the transaction is what conveys and facilitates this operation. So when I have a transaction and it just has one output, and it consumes, when you have a transaction with one output, you can't just think in terms of that one output, because, well, where does that transaction get money from? Right? Where does the every output has a value. So every input unlocks an output that was previously locked, and so there's different locks that we'll get into, and then there's value that is associated with the output. So what happens is, suppose that in my example here, in example A, I have a transaction and it locks, 4 units of value into an output. Then we have this output here, and it now exists, and it had to get that money from somewhere. It had to take, these satoshis, which are called these units of value, and pull them in from other places. So an input had to come in from a previous transaction output in Bitcoin and provide, maybe this one provided 3, and this one over here provided 2. So now we have 3 plus 2, and the total is 5 input and 4 output over there, right? And then we leave the extra. So there's some extra output here, which I'll do with a dashed arrow. And that goes 1 output value to the miner. So that's not actually in the transaction, so I'll kind of cross it out. But it is going to the miner. So if I submitted this transaction where I successfully unlocked 3 and successfully unlocked 2 units of value as input, and then made the output go to I made my one that I wanted, which is a value of 4, and then I leave the other ones free, so I have a difference of 1. Then that one output, which doesn't exist, that is going to the Bitcoin miner. So I send that transaction off, and whichever Bitcoin miner takes my Bitcoin transaction and puts it into the blockchain, they make money for doing that. So that's how we can pay miners to do things in Bitcoin. So now we understand the concept of we can use these transactions to consume inputs and to create outputs. Now, I can do something like a lock with this. So assuming I have enough inputs in my transaction, which I'll just represent like that, so we know that this transaction has enough inputs for our thinking process here, so it's funded enough, right? We can do an output that says, well, I want to have some money sent to, we could say money, units of value, these Satoshis in Bitcoin, sent, we'll say, 5 Satoshis are sent to Alice. We'll say Alice is receiving 5 Satoshis. And how do we do that? Well, we have a lock on the output. So we say, this output can only be unlocked by using a number, a private key that Alice has. And so by enabling this private key, meaning Alice has a number that nobody else has, whoever made this transaction is sending some money to Alice in such a way, they've talked to Alice and they know her, they don't know her private key, but they know her public key, which is derived from that random number, in such a way that only Alice can prove, right? So it's like, whoever matches this this fingerprint, or who can unlock this this output, that's related to the private key. And so Alice has this secret way of unlocking that lock, and essentially the point is only Alice can unlock that lock and get those 5 units of value. So that's some basics of locks, and you can do more advanced locks as well. So, and not everything in a lock has to be related to controlling access, actually. You can put some notes in there about what it represents, and that's where we can get to tokenization. So when we think of tokenization in this way, tokenization, going back to what are we representing? Well, these outputs that represent value, they can be anything. I mean, you could put data in them. So one example, I could have a lock that basically goes to Alice, and I could say, well, this represents, right? This token represents ownership of something valuable outside of these units. So instead of saying, well, there's only 5 units here, we'll cross that out, and we'll say there's a negligible number of units, right? So we'll say 0.1 units of value. And now I'm not giving this to Alice so that she can unlock the value anymore. I'm actually giving it to her so that the lock represents her ownership of something more. And that's what a token is. So that representation of something more is important. Because what that means is, within the context of this transaction, this output here, going to Alice, is representing ownership of something. And that something could be whatever Alice and the person who she's dealing with is whatever they are, whatever context they're working in. There's now a record, right? So let's go back here again and kind of get rid of these things. So there's a record that enables the transfer of value. And that's important because when we can convey value through these outputs and locks, we can stipulate the terms under which the value is exchanged. So every output creates a lock, a locking program in Bitcoin. And that locking program can be very simple, such as that system I described previously for identifying that only Alice can unlock something. But it can also be a lot more complex. It can do things like Alice can unlock this if she takes it within the next 2 weeks. But if not, then Bob will be able to unlock and use. So that means that there's like limited time offers that can be put in place and things of that nature on these locking programs. It's a way of managing value, of managing assets, right? Whatever value we want to convey, firstly, we need to know there is value. And secondly, it needs to be conveyed. And however we can do that, we can encode the rules of the system into the ways that value is transferred through these locks. So what is a tangible example of this? Let's say that there's a car dealership. And when let's say there's a car manufacturer, and we'll start there. When a car manufacturer manufactures a new car, they could create a funded Bitcoin transaction with an output that represents ownership of the car. And at that point, the car exists, and maybe in that output, there's a document, and that document has some information about the car. Its VIN number, things like that. It's just been manufactured. Newly minted token that is associated with the car. And the only person who can unlock that value is the person who owns the car, which in this case is the manufacturer, right? And so now there's a record of the ownership of this car through this transaction. And when the manufacturer goes to sell the car to a dealership, we can then use that output as an input. Manufacturer unlocks the lock on the output, and then the manufacturer creates a transaction conveying that same output. And of course, there's going to be other irrelevant inputs and maybe an irrelevant output or two in this transaction. But the important one is the one associated with the car, conveying ownership, right, through an embedded document or digital signature, conveying ownership of the car to the dealership. And of course, locking it in such a way. There's our little padlock with our key. We'll put a key on that one over there too. The only person that can unlock this lock now, which represents ownership of this vehicle, is the dealership. Now they own the car. And what they can do is have an auction. So if they're auctioning off a car, which, maybe that's a thing that happens. They could encode the rules for that auction into another transaction and say, whoever can unlock this lock, right? Here's a third transaction, and you get the idea, right? So you're saying, now we've got all these people over here, and they're all basically trying to bid on this output over here, and so they're all putting in bids, and they're all trying to unlock the value that is associated with it, and they're following the rules of the program that was defined in that contract, in that document that was embedded in that output that conveys and represents ownership of the car. So that document can be updated multiple times, and in Bitcoin this is true. You can have transactions that are called non-finals, which are just intermediate states of a transaction, representing intermediate stages of a contract, such as an auction, where nothing's been sold yet, but where we have a way of conveying this. So the token is then representative of that value, and it is then shown, right? The output is then used to define the constraints under which the transfer can occur. Eventually, someone wins the auction. So I'm going to move back over here. So whoever wins the auction is able to successfully create a Bitcoin transaction that redeems with some other random inputs that don't really matter. Well, that's over there too, to fund it, right? But then the important one is they get the output out. Now it's their car. Why? Well, because the document that they put in here says that here's the VIN number of the car, here's their name, here's their signature. It's their car. Transfers ownership. So only they can unlock that. And if they ever sell their car, of course they will unlock it, but not necessarily immediately, maybe 10 years later. Now, if I go to sell my car 10 years later, someone gives me money, and they give me their information so that I can create this transfer. And so when I go to transfer the car, I then create another transaction. I then make the output go to the buyer, right? And this one was locked before, but now it's unlocked, yada, yada. Now the buyer has ownership of the car, and it goes on, so on and so forth, right? It continues. So when the buyer wants to see the history of ownership, he can look back at this input which he received, and he can go and trace it back through to all of the other inputs, all the way back to the beginning. And he can do that in such a way that he knows that this car was manufactured by this this car maker, and was then sent to the dealership, and was then sent to this buyer, the original owner, which then transferred it, and now it's now it's representing that I now own it, right? So using scripts, these locking programs in Bitcoin to represent the conveyances of value associated with a valuable thing is how we can use Bitcoin as a token system. And it's very direct and it's very simple, right? The number of Bitcoin units of value, the satoshis in a transaction, are generally token amounts. And by that I mean small amounts, like actually token amounts. Like they don't really matter, they're representing something more, right? Like in a military operation, you could set a token force. It's like, well, I'm giving you a force just to say that it's a representing my, it's like a small thing in that case. But the point is, it's a token amount. When you have these output amounts, the amount of Satoshis in there is enough to represent it, no less. Can't be zero, but it's enough to represent a conveyance of value. But beyond that, it's not important. What's important is the understanding that is made between the parties about the conveyance of value. The understanding that this token represents ownership of a car. And the documentation of that understanding through other information, metadata that is part of the locking program that controls when that car can be transferred in the future, in our example. So that's how tokenization works at a fundamental level. And this is one way of doing tokenization in the Bitcoin system. So even if my car has been transferred 10 times, 100 times even, and there's scanned documents where I had to take a photo of a document with my phone, the bill of sale or whatever, and there's like 10 or 20 of those, right? Scanned documents, each of them are like 1 megabyte in size or some size, we think of this. Well, when I get ownership of that car, I get to see those previous scanned documents, and that information is sent to me by, the software that tracks ownership, or by the previous owner. So my assets, those things that I own, are carrying legal weight at that point. I have this tokenization system where I can then manage my assets through these conveyances of value, these contracts between parties, which are represented digitally, but which are really a meeting of the minds about what is valuable. And the blockchain serves as an immutable record of all of that. It keeps everyone honest. That's what it does. So no one can say, well, back in this time, it's like, well, no, it's, you can't go back and change. There's no, when you think of this as a statement of accounts and ownership, you can't go back and change things. So that is an important concept, I would say, to get people to understand. And you can use a lot of the tools that have been created by Babbage and by others to implement tokenization on top of the Bitcoin blockchain. And people ask, well, what token protocol should be used, right? What way should we use to actually do these locks and everything? And the answer is, well, it's different depending on what your application is. If your application is titles to a car, you'll want to, you'll probably be a title registry or a government entity of some kind wanting to track ownership or something. But you'll want an app or some program that can be used to convey that kind of value. And so you'll want a way of doing that. There are different systems that are suitable for doing different components of tokenization within Bitcoin. And there are a number of different ways to achieve that. But the answer is going to be use, in my opinion, there's other people doing different things, but define the constraints under which the transfer can be conveyed in terms of a set of criteria that must be met within the locking program, and embed the metadata that is representative of the token's ownership characteristics into the locking program so that there's record of that, including references to hashes of files such as, scanned copy of documents, digital signatures, that can be embedded in the locking program as well as in the metadata associated with it. And then use the concept of a Bitcoin output where you put at least one Satoshi, locking it up as a representation of the thing being conveyed. And then, when those conditions are met, such as when I want to sell my car, I unlock the locking program, I create a Bitcoin transaction, which uses that previous token as input, and creates a new token as output, which also represents the thing that I am conveying. And I can then transfer that to, I can incorporate the updated state. That reason which I am making the Bitcoin transaction should then be incorporated into the updated output in the new transaction. So I'm consuming the old one and unlocking it, and then I'm creating a new one with the updated set of embedded metadata and script unlocking programs, which may vary depending on your application and what you're doing, whether you're transferring ownership, whether you're just moving it around for some reason, to, for example, change your address of record with a title company. I don't know. There's different things that you can do to update things, and it's going to vary widely, I say, between applications. So there is not one tokenization protocol, but I argue that an effective tokenization protocol makes use of the inherent properties of Bitcoin UTXOs because they are those things that represent value, right? We represent value with tokens, and the units of Bitcoin are tokens that represent something, and thus they can be locked up and associated with metadata in different ways by parties, and those parties are then able to exchange and do so in a way that they see fit. So when I want to deal with somebody, I go to them and I show them the tokens that I have, and if those tokens are acceptable to them, if the histories have been revealed and are acceptable, then the value transfer goes ahead. Right? And humans agree, right? There's a meeting of the minds, there's consideration, and a contract occurs, a transfer occurs, a transaction makes record of that transfer, and the updated state is reflected in the updated output that represents that thing being transferred and that metadata associated with that transaction. That's how tokenization works in Bitcoin, folks. I think it's a lot simpler than people think, but it's also very dynamic, and there's different locking conditions which are associated with things like an auction, as I described, or with whatever you're transferring. Of course, the token that governs the title to my house might have 3 signatures required, one from an escrow company that I employ on my behalf, but or like a title security I don't know. Versus the one that governs my bus ticket, I think is going to be a little bit less robust. There might even be a time component where the one in my house cannot be valid for, there's a multi-transaction sequence that needs to happen in order for the transfer to actually go through. You can do a lot with multi-stage transactions that convey value in different ways. I guess I'll bring up the iPad again to show what I mean. I guess I've got to open it up again here. So I'll clear this. When I say a multi-stage transaction, like for example, maybe there's like 3 or 4 steps that need to happen if I ever want to open up that token that represents the ownership deed to my house. So let's suppose I have my house over here, so there's the transaction with an output representing the token from my house, and in order for that to be unlocked, I have to do 2 things. I have to create a set of transactions that obtain signatures from the various, whether it's a bank or title security company of some kind, that happens. So we get one signature in one transaction, and then it gets sent again, and then the next party has to sign. And then this is all defined by that initial script, right? Up here, it's already defined in that program. We already know what the rules are. But then we have to go get this one. And only after getting to this state, right? Only after getting to this transaction's state, this has all been happening without ever unlocking and actually, consuming that output yet, because maybe it was from a second one. And then what I need to do is to actually effectuate the transfer in this multi-transaction sequence. I would then need to take all of this data, right? Take all of this data and all of these things that have been met, these criteria, these checkboxes that have been met, these signatures that have been acquired, and I might then use that as a way to transfer to the next transaction, right? So I use all of that data as an input to the other branch of the contract, which says that once this has been done, then I use, right, then there's the house again, and, right, so I try to draw a house, and then it's locked again to the next owner or something like that. So you can do a lot of complicated rules, and this is really an arrow. So, once that's been done, you use that as a way to unlock the actual thing and get it to move. After you've done that multi-transaction sequence, it can be pushed into the script and validated according to the rules, and that can be pre-coded in advance. So what I'm saying is there's complicated structures that can be defined, and these complicated structures can be incorporated into the constraints that govern the transfers of tokenized assets. And so that's how you can do advanced capabilities of tokenization within the Bitcoin ecosystem by using UTXOs, scripts, and Satoshis in the way they were originally intended. I think that's everything I have to say in this one, so I'll end it here. I hope you've enjoyed this format and this content. Let me know if you disagree or if you'd like to discuss further. I know that there are other ways of doing this, and I respect that people have spent a lot of time in building some of those solutions. But I think that it's important that we get this right, and that the most people understand these debates and the rationale behind these different approaches. So that was my intention in producing this video. Thank you for watching.